Please, Nandini.
Yes, welcome to everybody who is already here. What do people think? Shall we just launch straight into it and whatever? Okay, so then good morning, everyone. Good morning, friends, colleagues, and audience members who have joined. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you especially to Laleh and to David for responding at very short notice to my invitation to have this conversation with each other, which, as you know, we've already started and we are almost not able to stop. So that's a great sign. I don't intend to stop you. I think I should begin by mentioning to the people who are here, who are not part of the organizing team, that it's being recorded. And it will be put on one of University of Exeter's YouTube channels. Therefore, if you wish not to display your name or indeed not to have your video on, then please feel free to do so. I shall also begin by framing what it is that we are doing here. My name is Nandini Chatterjee. I'm a historian of South Asia and I teach at the University of Exeter. And this gathering actually arose out of readings that I had been doing in preparation for my teaching, in which I read side by side the works of these two eminent scholars, Laleh and David. Now, since October 7th, of course, the entire world has been watching in horror as violence has relentlessly escalated in Israel and then the occupied Palestinian territories, especially Gaza. And I wish to begin by expressing my deep sorrow about the unnecessary loss of life and for all civilian victims of this conflict, Israeli and Palestinian. But this conversation is about a specific troubling aspect of that situation as it stands today, and that is the possibility discussed in many forums that the Israeli government may be inflicting collective punishment on the Palestinian inhabitants of Gaza. It is to be noted here, of course, as a framing that collective punishment is a war crime. However, there are debates around whether or not the actions of the Israeli government constitute collective punishment. Our principal aim here today, then, is to offer a way for interested parties to identify what may be collective punishment and how does one identify that. Today, we shall hear from two eminent historians who have studied the practice and effects of collective punishments in colonial contexts. Before we begin, it is my no doubt redundant duty to remind both our speakers that as specialists, you are expected to be accurate with facts to the best of your knowledge, and that any inaccuracies could negatively affect your own scholarly reputations, as well as that of the University of Exeter. With that out of the way, let me introduce our speakers. David Anderson, historian of the British Empire in East Africa, is the author of several books, including, in fact, books on environmental history, which David was talking about just before we started the session. But the book that is foremost on my mind today is his 2005 Histories of the Hanged, Britain's Dirty War in Kenya and the End of Empire, which Laleh has kindly displayed on screen. This research into Britain's counterinsurgency operations in the 1950s, Kenya, formed the basis also of Professor Anderson's expert witnessing in support of the claim of 5 elderly Kenyan individuals who claimed compensation from the British government for the torture they had suffered in colonial Kenya's internment camps. In 2013, and certainly partly due to Professor Anderson's witnessing, they were awarded something around the sum of £13 million. Professor Anderson's research and role in this case, more interestingly, perhaps, or as interestingly, also sparked debates worldwide, with many drawing parallels with Guantanamo Bay and other exceptional places of imprisonment. Laleh Khalili is similarly the author of many books and articles which as with a scholar of her size, her intellectual size are of a wide range of themes and scopes. She's written on policing, incarceration, not exclusively related to Palestine and Palestinians, but of course does focus on that area and those people. She also writes extensively on survival and identity and on practices of remembering and mourning through which people retain their identity in the most shocking of circumstances. Today, I would like to concentrate on an article Laleh wrote more than a decade ago, and which she pointed out to me when prepping for a class as part of a module I teach on law in the British Empire. I came across the fact that the individual who'd organized the police force in Kenya had also moved on to Palestine, this chap called RGB Spicer. And in my excitement, I wrote around to this scholarly group, and Laleh wrote back to say, well, actually, I had written about this many years ago. And then I started reading Laleh side by side with David, and something clicked for me. The article itself is The Location of Palestine in Global Counterinsurgencies, which was published in IJMIS, the International Journal of Middle Eastern Studies, in volume 42nd, issue 3rd. So this is my framing as an educator who's interested, who works themselves on mainly South Asia and also on pre-modern South Asia, but has also worked on the British Empire. But more importantly, my role here is as a citizen, but also as an educator. I'd like to understand how one can go about mobilizing the knowledges that you have created in order to understand our current situation. So thank you for agreeing to join us in this conversation. Also, thank you for your generosity and allowing me to take you back to work that you completed quite some time ago. Scholars, of course, move on. They don't do just the same thing for years and years. But having said that, actually, it's the work that keeps returning to us, both of you, for its importance. And in reading your work side by side, like I was mentioning, I was struck firstly by the similarities between the techniques of violence, if one can use that term, used by regimes in such different parts of the world. And secondly, especially after reading Laleh's work and also receiving guidance from her, I was also struck by not just the comparability, but the direct historical connections between them, such that it seemed to me once again, and I'd like to clarify this for our viewers and anybody who watches this video afterwards, regimes directly learned and borrowed from each other. And I'd like to learn from you how that happens. So let us start then with the observable similarities first. And I'll direct my questions to you by name because of the awkwardness of this virtual medium. Okay. So starting with David. David, your work on colonial law and policing in Kenya. When did you come across instances of collective punishment, and what did this consist of?
Well, the short answer to that is that it was very early on, and it is very, very pervasive. But there's a broader context that I would firstly like to set that relates to your comments, which is that people who study counterinsurgency globally are very fond of drawing comparisons. But the comparisons they draw are usually between British and French practices in colonial Asia and colonial Africa. And places like Vietnam, Algeria, and Kenya, Cyprus, Malaya feature prominently in these discussions. And there have been many quite well-known books written about counterinsurgency that deal with only those cases, plus sometimes the American cases in the Philippines. Everyone completely ignores the two states on the planet who have been most involved in counterinsurgency: Israel and South Africa. And I've never understood why there is this blind spot. Why not look at these two states? They've been involved over more years in more kinds of counterinsurgency than anybody else. And the truth is that when we go into the archives on the French and British side in particular, we discover that they have very close contacts with Israel and South Africa, and that they are all, in fact, assisting each other in developing counterinsurgency techniques. So these links, these collaborations, are absolutely critical to the history, and I don't think they are yet properly understood or fully explored. So that's my first point. So there's a broader issue here. But when we then look at colonial law and collective punishment, in the Kenyan case, collective punishment was embedded in the legislature from the very beginning of colonial rule. So Kenya adopted the Indian Penal Codes in 1895, and they contained elements that permitted the state to add collective punishments to other kinds of legal sanction. Now, initially, the state didn't use this very much, but in the very early 1900s, 1904-05, the state added new legislation that explicitly uses collective punishment. So the key example is the crime of livestock theft, which was very prevalent in Kenya at the time and was thought by the colonials to be a crime that Africans did not really consider to be dishonest. So they attempted to cultivate a community opposition to the crime by implementing collective punishment. So that if someone from your village stole animals from a settler farm, a white settler farm nearby, and it was discovered the animals had been run through your village after the theft, even if they were now nowhere to be found, that village could then be fined collectively. And that fine, the minimum of that fine would be 10 times the value of the stolen property. So if 10 cows were stolen, you were fined 100. Now that law remained on Kenya's statute books until 1963. And the principle of collective punishment in offences of stock theft still remains on the Kenyan legislature today. So the Kenyan state still retains the authority to make fines of this kind. Collective punishments could also be implemented in Kenya by order of the governor where there was considered to be a threat of disorder, and disorder might even be a public gathering or a potential riot. It need not be anything that's already happened, but also the threat of insurrection. Now, from 1904 until 1952, when the Mau Mau Rebellion began, Kenya had used that collective punishment law to implement collective punishments against projected insurrections more than 30 times. So in other words, this law is being used regularly, and the way it's used in that context is that a military or police levy is sent into an area and it is charged to the local community. And they also implement a fine against the community in property and possessions. So that fine might involve taking livestock, it might involve seizing crops, it might involve the destruction of property. So the burning of villages would be one element of it, and that is purposeful displacement. So that's used to get people to move, and in some cases there is suspicion that that was used as a way of securitizing certain parts of the land by moving people off it and allowing the military or the police to control it. So collective punishments has several different registers, several different levels. It's not used in Kenya in a small way. It's used extensively and regularly. Yet one final point is that it's supposed to be controlled. So the British are aware that this is a fairly draconian kind of punishment, and there is discussion of that. And judges quite often raise queries about it, saying, is this actually fair? Does this not go against the principles of English law? And the answer to this is always given, well, we hold these powers in reserve, and they are only used when there is a desperate situation and the governor's office has to approve it. In other words, a local officer can't implement this themselves. Now that survives up until 52. But during the Mau Mau insurgency and the counterinsurgency against it, this limitation is removed. So that within 6 months of the emergency starting, collective punishments can be imposed by local officers without the governor's sanction. And what this does is this hugely enlarges the number of cases, and it allows local officers to use this punishment as a way of implementing their authority. So in many cases now we find after 52, there is very little evidence even of collusion on the part of local communities. They are simply being punished because the local police officer or local district officer wants them punished. And there are, between 1952 and the end of 1956, there are over 120 collective punishment cases in Kenya that we know about. There could well be many more. Up until 2011, we couldn't count them at all because none of the files in the archive were available. We thought they'd been destroyed. We then got them through the Hanslope disclosure, and there are 220 files there relating to 110 cases. Those files survive, but my suspicion is there are many more that we don't know about. And certainly if one collects oral histories in Kenya about this period, many, many people refer to collective punishments very directly in their testimonies. And the collective punishments during Mau Mau, the scale of them amplified, so that villagers might lose 5,000 head of cattle in a single punishment. And in fact, if one goes to the National Archive at Kew, there are now photographic collections from the Mau Mau period. There is a whole set of photographs in those collections of collective punishments being implemented. So we can now visualize this in a way that we couldn't before. So the point is, this was there from the beginning, but it gets worse, it changes, and the changes made during the 1950s implementation were not then rescinded. So collective punishments continued to be a factor. And in fact, they were used in Kenya in the last 12 months, because the Kenyan government issued a declaration against what they call bandits in the northwest of the country, and they sent the military in under emergency powers and gave the military the authority to collectively punish these communities. And they removed thousands of people from their homes and their dwellings under these laws. So it hasn't gone away. This is yet another legal legacy of colonialism that lingers around in the present.
Thank you so much for taking us through that journey, David, for laying out the different registers at which what we are calling collective punishment took place, and also kind of to point out the post-colonial legacies of such. If I can, and this descriptive setting, as in just the what happened and when, I think it would be very useful for our viewers. So if I can invite Laleh to do the same for your area, where do you come across it?
So I think it's important for me to also, I take David's point about the fact that Israel and South Africa are often excluded from histories of counterinsurgency. But as someone who had studied Palestine for my first book, which was based on my PhD, when the US invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, and images began to emerge out of the kinds of military pacification activities, counterinsurgency activities that the US was engaging in Afghanistan with villages, in Iraq with cities, with notions of confinement, but then also images emerging, for example, from Abu Ghraib. One of the things that really struck me was the extent to which the methods that were being used in forms of confinement and punishing, the walls that were being built, for example, to separate out different parts of the city of Baghdad from each other, were actually familiar to me from the context of Palestine. At the same time, I was actually talking to people that had been prisoners in Israeli prisons, Palestinians that had been prisoners in Israeli prisons, and some of the things that they talked about, for example, the fact that they were forced into nakedness or that dogs were sicked on them, it was also something that they had been familiar with. And I had also read a book when I was a kid by Romain Gary called The White Dog, which is about the use of dogs that had been trained to attack African Americans in the U.S. South during this, before the Civil War movement. And then, of course, you also hear about the Dobermans in South Africa that were used to be sicked on black folks. And so actually the dogs were the reason that I began to look at what are the techniques of collective punishment and counterinsurgency that happen in moments of insurrection, that happen in moments of insurgency. That how do they travel? Why is it that there's Dobermans, for example, or why specifically Dobermans? That actually was the question that started me. And I began to look, and of course, as I said, David's book was one of the books that was enormously important to what I was reading, because it actually sort of laid out all of these different methods, techniques that were being used in 3 different spheres. And those 3 different spheres were the spheres that I became particularly interested in. So one was law or legislative. Certain elements, for example, administrative detention laws, which are used to hold people for supposedly legally determined lengths of time, but they can be extended again and again and again. So, for example, there are Palestinians today that have been held under administrative detention for something like 24 months. That means without trial, that means without ever having been brought in front of a court. There's like no writ of habeas corpus that applies to these administrative detention laws. But there are other kinds of laws also that are implemented, which I found really interesting. And I found it fascinating that administrative detention, for example, was something that was used in India. It was used in Palestine. It was used across the various imperial holdings of Britain in Africa. And that it remained in effect after the end of empire. So during the Indian emergency, Indira Gandhi used administrative detention laws to hold people. Israel continues to hold that, and in fact has tightened in some ways, made it much more punitive in some ways. And as David just mentioned, those administrative detention laws or other forms of legislative collective punishments for one person's activities against the whole category of people is something that Kenya uses, but other countries which were under British law also use. The second element that I was interested in were politically administrative processes. And to me, one of the most fascinating was, for example, things like recording of people's identifications and using identification processes, the ID card that you have to produce, for example, in order to do anything administrative, using those identification processes as modes of divvying up people into segments. Sometimes this was ethnically done. In fact, ethne emerges as a mode of categorization in ways that didn't exist beforehand. Linguistically, religiously, according to location, according to one's profession, according to which city you live in, according to whether you're engaged in pastoral work or in agricultural work. So these identification cards, registries, recordings, which began with something like a big old register and pieces of paper, and now are, iris scans, for example. Sophisticated technology is constantly introduced into this process. These administrative processes were also used as modes of punishment. So that if you, for example, have an ID card of a certain color, if your village is being, or if your town is being punished, if there's a shutdown, for example, in Palestine today, your entire village, anybody carrying that ID card is refused entry or exit from your village, depending on, how the walls are built around you. And then the third element that I was, and again, as David has written, these kinds of methods were perfected in locations and then transmitted in all sorts of places. So I found elements of that in Kenya, elements of that in Malaya in particular, but also in India before, obviously before 1947. And then the third element that I was particularly interested in, and that's because I've always been fascinated by the military and policing elements, was the military techniques or policing techniques. And these were everything from forms of confinement, imprisonment, the sort of strategic hamlets were supposedly like a villagization program, but they were in effect actually placing people inside confined areas. The Boer War concentration camps, the reconcentrados of Cuba and the Philippines, but the new villages of Malaya, and you keep getting these everywhere. And so I think, to me, that was fascinating. The second, so these were the techniques that I was interested in. But the broader context was also interesting to me. And that broader context is something that you asked about, Nandini, and that's that it seems that people who study revolutions know that revolutions happen, they snowball, right? You have one particular moment and you have loads of revolutions happening. News travels, revolutionaries travel. Well, the same thing also happens with insurgencies and counterinsurgencies. So you end up having bunched up moments of revolt. So end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century is one such moment. You have the Boer War happening, you have the Mahdi revolt in Sudan happening, you have the Northwest Frontier Province revolts are happening. There are also revolts happening in Calcutta and other places. There are revolts happening in the islands that were on the archipelagos that the Dutch were controlling. So there were revolts happening at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. And what is fascinating is the extent to which there is travel in knowledge about putting down these revolts. That's one moment. The second moment is, of course, that moment of decolonization after the Second World War, 1950s and 60s. You have Algeria happening. You have, across vast swathes of Africa and Asia. And again, what you see is that people travel. And then finally, the moment that I studied in my time in the shadows, in my book of 2013, is the moment in the 21st century where the Israeli counterinsurgencies in Palestine, also some in Lebanon, are being matched by US counterinsurgencies in lots of places. Obviously Afghanistan and Iraq, but also Somalia, Yemen, and lots of other locations. And what is really interesting is that there are, in the interstices of these bunched up moments of insurgency, there are particular locales which act as a kind of a transmission node for forms of knowledge. And Mandate Palestine in the 1930s, under the British imperial control, and Palestine, again, from 1948 until today, is one of these nodes where methods, legal, military, and administrative or political, are perfected and transmitted. And they're transmitted through doctrines, through people moving, through ideas, through reporting. One person that I love to often mention is Moshe Dayan, who was at one point the Minister of Defense in Israel, but also held lots of other positions. He was an incredibly articulate and very eloquent advocate of collective punishment in a variety of ways. But he actually, because he was so well-spoken and eloquent, and he was funny and he was very well-read, he would be invited to all sorts of places to comment on stuff. So he was invited, for example, by the French to Algeria in the 1950s so that they could have an exchange of views. And he actually took the use of helicopters by the French and took it back as helicopters as a kind of a counterinsurgency where you could shoot out of the helicopter or throw people out of a helicopter. Took it from Algeria to Palestine. Moshe Dayan, however, acted not only as a general. When the Vietnam War was happening, he actually was sent by a couple of Israeli newspapers to Vietnam to act as a journalist. And of course, because he was Moshe Dayan, he got to meet with lots of American generals. And it was fascinating because as a journalist, he then transmitted information about US counterinsurgency in Vietnam to Israel-Palestine and vice versa. So he was like one of these incredible figures who perfected these modalities. One of the reasons that I really like to look at him, and I'm going to end on this and then hand the floor back to you, is that he wrote something in the immediate aftermath of the occupation of West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza in 1967. And one of the things that he was arguing with some of the sort of more fascist-adjacent right-wingers in his own government, because he was a Labour politician. And he said, what we need to do is not to bring police into it. What we need to do is we need to connect the electricity grid in Hebron to our Israeli electricity grid, because the moment that they have a revolt, all we have to do is cut their electricity. That is better than a whole raft of policemen, because that will essentially cut off their ability to do anything. And that stuck with me. That is a form of collective punishment, cutting off electricity because there's an insurrection going on, which has been used again and again and again and again since then. And so it is transforming a civilian infrastructure, weaponizing it in ways that we recognize even today in Gaza.
Thank you so much for giving such a rich overview of obviously the vast amounts of research that both of you have done. I'm going to propose that actually those who watch this can actually think of this first section, really, because we are halfway through our time, should think of this first section as the kind of meat of the substance that we're talking about, and then basically take, and I'm sorry for the slightly gory metaphor, but then take their knives to it now, following yourselves, because here's where we start asking the more incisive questions. And at the risk of some discourtesy, I'm going to ask our scholars now to kind of think of this, of my following questions in somewhat in a journalistic sense, as you might do while retaining your expertise. So now I'm going to ask you, well, you've told us this, so how does this work out? And I want these very punchy answers if that's what's suitable. Of course, feel free, your scholars, to diverge as you need. So these are my thematic questions that follow now from the material that you have presented. My question too was going to be about the justifications for collective punishment, as in the historic justifications that were used by the regimes that you have described for using collective punishments. And I had two particular kinds of justifications in view, but a third actually suggested itself to me as I heard you speaking. But let me tell you what those two are and whether you come across them. So my question is, what were the justifications? Among them, did you come across the justification of atrocities committed specifically against settler communities, which seem to justify settler violence, and retaliatory state violence? So both of these things. And secondly, did you come across allegations of national characteristics of colonized people as being particularly susceptible and to such punishment methods and control methods? So these are my two questions, but a third question actually does occur to me, and I want to just put it out there. We started talking of collective punishments, and both of you went straight into counterinsurgency. So there's something about rebelling against the constituted regime and the supposed emergency that creates. And I wonder whether you come across those justifications as well. So David.
Well, I think let me start with your third suggestion, because I think that collective punishment in the British colonial context was quite closely linked to ideas about insurrection or the threat of insurrection. Because in order to implement it initially, at least, later on it would change, but initially you needed to be able to justify back to London that there was a reason. And that is why the governor's office would be responsible for signing off on what happened. So often, to justify it, you would make the case that there was a planned insurrection. Now, sometimes the case was pretty thin, and there may well be other things going on, but that was how you framed the justification. So your question is absolutely spot on, I think. But your other two are also important. Early on in East Africa and indeed in West Africa, collective punishments were used in the Gold Coast and in Nigeria also, and in Sierra Leone. National characteristics was very much part of the debate around why these punishments were needed. So when lawyers objected to this being an offence against English justice, they were told that English justice wasn't yet suitable for the people who lived here because they hadn't reached the stage of development where they could understand the subtleties of this justice system. And therefore, we had to find punishments that were suitable for their stage of development. And collective punishment was seen as a suitable punishment because it would inculcate a different set of values in people. And this is actually discussed in the archive documents, that you're trying to change people's habits of mind by making them take responsibility collectively for the actions of others. And quite often there's a generational dynamic to this. So the people carrying out the acts that you're trying to stop are often quite young, and the people you're punishing are their elders. And what in effect you're doing is trying to implement the ideology of indirect rule. You're trying to get the elders to control the juniors so that you don't have to do it yourself. So again, empire on the cheap. So national characteristics is very much part of that dialogue. By the time we get into a situation where insurrection has begun, then your point of atrocities becomes important. In many of the collective punishments in Kenya, and the same was true in Cyprus and in Malaya, British actions were linked to alleged atrocities. So there'd be a direct correlation. It would be assumed if a European officer was murdered, then all the people in that location were held in some way responsible. If they didn't provide information that would lead to the possible capture of the perpetrators, then the entire community might be subject to a collective fine. So very much it's linked to individual events. And one of the interesting aspects of this then is both to look at when collective punishments are administered around atrocities and when they're not. And there are some very notable major atrocities in Kenya, but there are atrocities that are committed by the wrong side. They're committed by Britain's allies against Britain's enemies. And the same thing happens in Turkey, where in Cyprus, where the Turkish police commit offenses against local Greeks. And in Kenya, it's loyalist forces who commit atrocities against their African brothers. Those are not the subject of collective punishments, even though the extent of that atrocity may be greater. So atrocity itself is not enough. It depends who perpetrates that atrocity, what will happen.
Thank you so much, David. Passing on to Laleh here.
I think that's absolutely applicable also in the context of Palestine and elsewhere in the Arab world. With one additional, it's not a proviso or a qualification, but actually an addition, which is that the atrocities, in particular in the context of the Arab world, you know, the Arabs are there's an entire Orientalist way of thinking about the Arabs as wily or as particularly brutal, as particularly, you know, there's a whole set of sort of stereotypes and cliches that emerge around them that have emerged out of years and years of a whole vast series of ways of racializing knowledge production. So you've got the Orientalist, you've got the sort of the civilizational, you've got the legal, which as David said, there's entire legal things, which are they're savages, they're barbarians, and then they're civilized, and each of them requires a kind of a different set of responses by the law. That one thing that was really interesting about the Arab world, and I think it has been, actually it also applied to South Asia and elsewhere, it was what in a 19th century text was called outrages against our women.
Yeah.
So there is a particular sense of horror as our women, i.e. women who are often read as white and Christian and European, outrages by black and brown people. And so there is within that a kind of a gendering going on, a fear of miscegenation going on. Because the outrages don't have to be rapes, they don't even have to be assaults. They could be simply that a white woman chose a black or brown partner, but that could be justification for actually for attacks against them, which emerges out of a form of racialization which is inseparable from forms of gender discipline, gender and sexual discipline. And so I think that element really is very, very prominent in a lot of the discussions that you see across the different counterinsurgencies in the Arab world. One thing that the national characteristic thing that to me that is also interesting is that I think certainly in a lot of the Arab world, and I suspect that in Africa as well, but also possibly in South Asia, I don't know so much about South Asia. One of the things also that happens is that the tribe emerges as a sort of an administrative and racializing category. So it's not so much a national characteristic, but an imagination of a form of organization that can be used as a conduit for disciplining or punishment. And so if you imagine the people you're controlling, not as individuals, not as citizens, not even as subjects, but as a tribal collective, then the modalities of control and discipline and punishment that you're going to use are going to be not applied to them as individuals or citizens or subjects. It's going to be applied to them as a tribe. And I think, or as a clan, or as whatever the terminology is that they choose to use. And one of the things that is particularly present in the case of Palestine was this usage of tribes or clans or hamulas or whatever by the British during the Mandate period, but also subsequently and since then by the State of Israel against, for example, Bedouin groupings, against, for example, particular categories of Palestinians that live in a particular location, and against entirely against entire families which are constituted as a collective. But the family is extensive and large and numerous, and which is also partially explains why we're seeing the wiping out of so many families whenever that there's an Israeli counterinsurgency going on, is that entire families are punished, or entire tribes or clans or lineages are punished for the crimes of one. Houses are destroyed, buildings are blown up, families are expelled, their identity cards are taken away, etc., etc. So I think that there are specific ways that these kinds of the 3-4 modalities that you described, Nandini, are used, which I think in the context of the Arab world is particularly relevant. One final thing that I want to say is also the excuses, the atrocities that are used don't even have to be atrocious. They can be just a reinterpretation of a particular action in a way that falls outside of the law. So banditry, piracy, and terror are the 3 words that have been used throughout from the late 19th century, including the word terror, from the late 19th century onward, which are often a reinterpretation of the actions of the people that you're controlling as something that falls outside of the law. And what David said about if our allies do it, it's not terror, it's not banditry, it's not piracy. But if our enemies do it, it is. That I think is also something that that categorization is often quite alarming, startling, interesting to see across different kinds of settings.
And I'm sure you're aware, Laleh, that in the 1930s in Palestine, British officers who were criticized for abuse, for torturing prisoners, or for committing atrocities of collective punishments on villages, would make the excuse that, oh, it wasn't really them, it was their men. It was the Ottomans who were on their side fighting with them. Because, of course, they said these people used what they called Turkish methods. That was the euphemism, Turkish methods. And that euphemism passes into other parts of the empire. So you see people in Kenya and Nigeria talking about if something happens, oh, it was, we lapsed into Turkish methods. So this othering of the behavior, I think, is very, very interesting. And also what you say about the gendered aspect of this and the miscegenation fears, absolutely critical. In Kenya's case, in the late 1920s, they had a problem with a group who they thought were organizing an insurrection. They monitored them for 3 or 4 years, but didn't take any direct action until elements of that group attacked a settler community to steal weapons and other supplies. And in that attack, a white woman was raped. And then, only then, did the state act. And what the state then does in Kenya is to issue what I think is still a very unique piece of legislation, which was called the Libon's Removal Ordinance of 1934. And with this ordinance, they displaced 800 families, all of one clan, from their homes and moved them 400 kilometers to another area where they kept them in what was basically an open prison camp for the next 25 years. And that case is now the subject of a legal claim being made by those families against the British for that displacement. But it was a collective punishment against all people of a particular clan. So all these people were related to each other, and they were all moved. And in the archives, it's incredible. They are listed by name. We know who every one of them was, including the children. And also their chattels and their belongings are listed. So this is a very unusual legal case where the lawyers actually have, from the 1930s, the details of this in their fingers. And they can take this case in a quite unique way. I think it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with it.
Thank you so much. I mean, I can't help but pedantically kind of point out to any viewer that actually, because I asked the question about atrocity, how both of you have actually taken the question of atrocity apart and pointed out, number one, that what is called an atrocity needn't be atrocious, needn't have been atrocious at all, that the principle itself is not uniform. And actually, as a South Asianist, I can't help pointing out that the fantasy of the raped white woman is indeed a fantasy in 1857-58, where the rebellion takes place in North India. And so much of the horror and collective punishments there, entailing the burning of villages, hanging up of children from trees, etc., is very much premised on this threat to the white woman's body and the difficulty in actually proving that any of that actually happened. I mean, it's something really quite striking. So I'm actually going to ask you a question of which I'm really pessimistic about the answer straight away. But you are talking of colonial context. You have both constantly pointed to the post-colonial. I'm going to ask you this question naively. When and why, if ever, did these justifications that you talk about lose rhetorical force in the areas that you know about?
Well, it's a good question because it highlights the point that in most cases of colonialism where legal oppressions of this kind are being authorized, there is pushback. There's always a liberal voice trying to counter this and trying to object to it. And from time to time, those liberal voices get traction and they're able to bring about some kind of shift or change. So in the British case with collective punishments, most colonies throughout British Africa get rid of collective punishment in the 40s and early 50s. So as there becomes to be legal reform of the legislature, this begins to diminish. And in most cases, it's diminishing because it's not being very much used. But in cases like Kenya, where it is being used, they fight against it. They argue back to London that they need it, and they make special claims and special conditions for keeping it. So there is pushback, but its effects are not even across all parts of the empire. But there are debates about it. And in those debates, I think historians can begin to understand the kind of motivations you referred to earlier. How is this law justified? How is it supported? Who wants it? Who doesn't want it? And I think we get some good insights on that by looking at those sources. However, one of the ironic things here is that as we move to independence in the African colonies, incoming colonial, post-colonial governments, African nationalists, who've often been the victims of these laws, don't want to get rid of them. They end up keeping them, largely because they see them as a useful device for controlling dissent and opposition. So in Kenya's case, the emergency powers regulations are not removed. They are translated into a new bill on public security, and all of the same allowances are maintained, including detention without trial, would you believe? And these are almost immediately in Kenya put into practice because Kenya comes to independence at war. In its northern area, it has what's called the Shifter Rebellion. Shifter is another word for bandit, to emphasize the earlier point made by Laleh. And they use these laws immediately in a very similar way to how their colonial predecessors have used them. So yes, there is debate about pushback. There is an attempt to remove it. But that doesn't really have much appeal for people in power who see these laws as a useful device. And I think we've seen that they've been less used in more recent years. But very occasionally, as in Kenya quite recently, they come surging back. So the fact they remain on the statute book in many countries is, I think, more important. You know, we may have had some pushback in the past, but it hasn't got rid of them. They're still there. And although we, I think anyone who understands how systems of law operate would find these collective punishments odd, to say the least, and in some contexts even aberrant, they still remain.
Can I move to Laleh to ask that question?
So, as someone who grew up in revolutionary Iran, it is impossible in some ways to talk about systems of control without also talking about moments of revolt against those systems of control. And in the context of counterinsurgency, my last chapter is called The Fracture of Good Order, which comes from a poem by one of the Berrigan brothers, a couple of Catholic priests in the US that burnt down recruitment centers during the Vietnam War and were actually prosecuted, and one of them spent some time in prison. But it's a poem by one of them which calls for the fracture of good order. So the forms of resistance are really enormously important. Now, the extent to which these forms of collective punishment are challenged, whether within the metropole or in the colonies, and whether they are changed over the process of decolonization or independence, really depends on the extent to which there is a sort of a concerted form of mobilization in the colonies, in the imperial holdings, in the places that are colonized or controlled, but also the ways in which coalition building can happen in the metropole with metropolitan powers, because one of the most powerful ways in which the colonized can wrest back some form of independence is by taking advantage of divisions and fissures in the imperial center. An example that I often really like to give is in the Boer War. What was fascinating about the various elements of the Boer War, insurgency and counterinsurgency that was happening, part of the appeal that happened in London at the time was by the Liberal Party and the suffragists who were affiliated with it, going off to South Africa to see the atrocities being committed by the British against the women and children of the Boers. In part, this, in the case of the Boer War, in part it happened because the Boers were white. The same suffragists, the same Liberal Party didn't care at all about the African victims of the British counterinsurgency. They didn't count them. They barely visited their concentration camps. They really focused on the white Boers. But it was interesting that it was a particular fissure within the metropole itself. what you also find in the 1950s and 60s is that the Labour Party itself, which has always actually been pretty pro-colonial, had factions within it. Barbara Castle, Fenner Brockway in particular, who were very attached to, very committed to a lot of this anti-colonial revolt in other places. But the reason that they were attached and committed to them was because of the mobilization by the intellectuals and by the leadership of those colonial revolts. So what you need to have is these forms of coalition building across national boundaries. You need to have forms of protest that are emerging, but you also have to have a sort of a change in the atmosphere and a change in the transformation in the atmosphere and the zeitgeist and the ways in which people are thinking about. And there have been moments when that change in zeitgeist has happened. So you have in the aftermath of the Second World War and the atrocities committed against the Jewish citizens across all of continental Europe, but also against other categories of people. That moment is a moment in which there is a kind of a belief in the possibility of transformation. There is in the 1970s, when the Troubles are happening in Northern Ireland, you also have a change in zeitgeist, where in response to all the anti-colonial movements that are emerging, and also because the Irish by this point have become white, they were not always considered to be white, but at this point they had become white. So you have this also change in zeitgeist, slowly transforming the way that British counterinsurgency in Northern Ireland was being viewed, and their atrocities there were being viewed. So you do have to have a shift in the atmosphere. You need to have something that transforms it. And sometimes this is like the horrors of something that has happened recently. Sometimes it is resistance. Sometimes it is the emergence of new movements that articulate themselves around new forms of personhood, new forms of solidarity, new forms of sort of being a global citizen. And one of the things that, for example, I'm seeing at this moment, which is probably the one thing that is really kind of a moment of hope for me, is that particularly in the US, which is of course the world metropole right now, what we're seeing is the emergence of new forms of articulation of identity and solidarity between, for example, groups like Jewish Voices for Palestine and Students for Justice for Palestine, and the way that they're sort of coalition building and the language they're using and the modalities of protest they're using, and the fact that they're demanding to be listened to, and the fact that they're also all younger people gives me hope, because it's like, we tried, but now they're doing amazing things, and I'm hoping that means that there will be a shift in the zeitgeist, if not in the immediate moment, at least in the coming 10, 15 years.
Thank you so much. And I don't want to actually reverse this kind of, at least this moment of optimism that we have reached. And I'm also conscious of the time. So I'm going to propose that I'm going to collapse a couple of our planned questions, because of course, conversations like kind of flow. One of the questions I had been planning to ask was, why do regimes share techniques? But I think you have actually answered that quite effectively already. It's because it's functional, because there isn't a single trajectory of progress towards a better and better world. I mean, regimes find things functional, even against so-called their own people, when it is about dissent, etc. I actually do want to squeeze in two final questions, and I request you to be succinct on them, but concentrate on the very last one. So I'll tell you what both those questions are, so that you know what's in store. One of my questions of what's with law? The air is heavy with law, and yet it's a law that seems to allow the breaking of law, and then people talk about law in trying to push against these kind of repressions. And yet everybody knows that it's not really the law that matters. So that's my one question, as in what's with law? And I am going to ask that my second question again, which is going to be about coming back to the diagnostics question that we started with. At what point and when can we actually turn to a present day regime and say, well, that looks terribly like the things we were talking about before. But if I could have like a very kind of succinct reaction to what's with law.
So I think the difficulty with understanding how law is deployed is that most people start from a liberal normative assumption that law is implemented for everyone's good, that it's a public good. This is completely wrong. Law is arrived at out of a contested quarrel about social values and public rights. And lawyers are always contesting everything. So that if you have a political economy in which illiberal views are more prevalent, then laws such as these we're discussing are more likely to be deployed and used. And you get fluctuations in that debate, but the law is always swinging back and forth between these different alternatives. Law is not defined as a public good. And I think we need, as historians, we need to be very, very clear on that. Your second question takes me back to some of the things we've touched upon, but maybe in a slightly different way. So I think that the mention that Laleh made of Northern Ireland a moment ago is very, very interesting, because in the UK there's a tendency these days to think of Northern Ireland as a colonial problem, and to some extent I and others may be responsible for that, having argued that it should be seen that way. But of course, you're quite right to point out that not everything that goes on in colonies could be done in Northern Ireland, that there were different perceptions about what was possible. So this raises the whole point that states that implement these kind of laws do have a sensitivity about how they can be used and what effect they might have. So collective punishments generally were not used in Northern Ireland. It was thought to be too close to home. If you do this in Belfast, people in Manchester might get a bit cross. But you can do this in Bengal or in Nairobi or wherever else, but you can't do it in Belfast. So although Northern Ireland ends up with colonial officials, and some very prominent ones, who were involved in collective punishments and in tortures and atrocities in the colonies, they don't necessarily do all of those things in Northern Ireland. They do some of them. So it's you may say, one of my friends described the other day to me as, so he said, so it's colonial light. Well, maybe that trivializes it a bit, but perhaps it also captures something. The second thing I would say about this is that in colonial context, we talk about these regulations being implemented under what are called emergency powers. And from the 1920s onwards, that's what the British term them. David French's excellent book, The British Way, gives an account of how this emerges out of martial law from the 19th century and what it becomes. But what we also need to remember is that colonial states were not the only ones doing these things. So if one looks at Central and Eastern Europe in the 1920s and 30s, especially with the rise of fascism and authoritarianism, we discover that nearly all the right-wing states there were practicing similar things under the rubric of states of exception. They would issue states of exception that allowed draconian laws to be implemented against particular groups or at particular moments of crisis, threatened insurrection, etc. And this is used in many European governments over this period. And the laws and the practices are almost identical to the colonial ones. So there's something functional about this to certain kinds of state power, of which colonialism is only but one example. And I think we need to think about that a little more carefully, because that helps us to understand why post-colonial states may also see these things to be justified, necessary, and may be willing to use them.
Yeah, that's absolutely brilliant and spot on. I do think that there is something in the ways in which sovereignty is articulated, in state sovereignty is articulated, that contains within it the will to violence against particular categories. And because so much of the definition of sovereignty with which we live emerges out of that system of governance, which included colonialism as its main overseas sort of component, from the God knows when until very, very recently. I think in part that element of violence against particular categories of people, particular categories of people are made the bearers of the violence of the state in order for the state to remain sovereign. So, I mean, there's a huge element of that in there. Now, the law ends up actually functioning as a servant of power in that case. I'm, on the one hand, deeply skeptical of the law ever doing anything for the subaltern without it being pushed to do something. So, thinking about it as an academic, I think the law, as David says, is often just essentially an instrument of order making, and an instrument of the sovereign. But I don't want to become as pessimistic as, for example, Sam Moyne has become about law. I want to also think about those moments in which the law can be used as a space of contestation. And the people that I often think about when I'm thinking about that space of contestation are the incredible folks of the Center for Constitutional Rights, for example, in the US, who have found themselves the targets of constant harassment by the state because they've actually decided to stand for the subaltern. So their use of law is an entirely political decision. They're not going with the law as some sort of a, the blind lady standing up there with her scale of justice. They imagine the law to be a political instrument, and they go forward with that understanding. And I think that is the only way in which the law can be used in a way that helps the subaltern. But and I want to end this with my contribution with a response to your question: what's with the law? Why the law so much? What is our attachment to it? And the only answer I've got is that we love storytelling as human beings. We love genres of storytelling, and we have different methods of storytelling. Every category of human beings likes a way of telling stories, and we call those stories different things. Origin myths, we call them history, we call them political science. But the law is a particularly powerful genre of storytelling. And what it does is the arc of narrative, the narrative arc that legal cases take, that legislation takes, imagines the world in that particular way, which we have all become accustomed to expecting, particular protagonists and particular antagonists and ways of struggle between them. And I think that the part of the appeal of the law is because of this element of appeal to the narrative monster inside of us. But in some ways, I do think that it is a very powerful genre of telling a story. And by imposing it on people, what we do is we come up with a ready-made understanding of who the goodies and the baddies are, which allows our consciences to rest when, in fact, our consciences should not be resting.
That's a beautiful place to end, actually, to talk about like the instrumental. We have talked so much about the instrumentalities of law as repressive tools. We began towards the end to talk about the law being instruments again in the hands of those who would push back against that repression. But you, Laleh, alert us to how law is a story as well, and that we need to watch out for that story because it's pushing us into very limited places. May that not happen. Thank you so much to both of you for the incredible conversation that you've had. And thank you for viewers who have been with us. This is the time where we stop the recording. and then we can take a few questions.
Just one moment.